This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson. Yes, hello, this is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome once again to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events happening in the world of politics, happenings in the world of technology, entertainment, international news, everything. We take everything and we take a step back from it and we look at it from a higher perspective. And if you've not tuned into the show before, what I mean by a higher perspective is a perspective that is, you could term it metaphysical, you could term it spiritual, you could term it, any way that you like. Basically, it's a way we have of dealing with the stories that we interact with on a daily basis that are presented to us in one way or another through various different types of media or through various types of mass communication. And we look at them as illusions, in a way. And this is not to discount the sense of reality that we have about them and the seriousness that we accord them. It is more to say that when we create these situations in which we all sort of participate in as a group, whether it be a major political situation as we are involved in now with the 2016 presidential campaign and all of the things that ensue there, whether it's a mass events like some of the terrorist attacks or the shootings that we've been through, or if it's news and information from other sources, whatever it is, we create these stories that we interact with. They are not true in the sense of the absolute truth, but they certainly feel true. And when we interact with them, we believe them to be true, as we should, because that's part of how we play this game of existence, if you will. So you must believe in the game, and you must follow the rules of whatever game is being set up. But on the other hand, you must also not lose sight of the fact that a game is just what it is. You play it with all you've got, but you also remember. And in fact, what we do is we use these things to remember. When stories get scary or situations in our lives seem overwhelming and fear arises, what you do is you go into it, although our first reaction might be to hide away from it, which you can do for a while, but it always comes back. But if you dive into it, if you take the energy from it and call it out for what it is, an illusion that you've created, and then, by the way, appreciate the level and intensity and depth of that illusion that has been created. Once you do that, you've mastered it. You've taken the teeth right out of that old monster. And not only that, it's given you strength. It's given you the ability to get your energy back and to continue on creating. So that's what I'm talking about. To me, it's a healthy way of interacting with stories that can sometimes feel very overwhelming, very button pushing, or just, I don't want to hear another word about what Donald Trump said, or, that level of frustration that I think we all reach when maybe we are just bombarded with too much information, which is quite easy to have happen in today's world. You don't even have to be, specifically tuned in to or have the television on. You could just be going about your daily business at work, or in the doctor's office, or whatever you're doing, driving a car or something, or just talking to someone. And these things will find you. They will find you. So two choices you have. If you're starting to feel overwhelmed, you can turn off the TV, and that works for a while. Or you can disconnect, or try to disconnect from all forms of media, which many people try to do, especially spiritual seekers. They often feel like they must, disconnect from, the world in that sense. And as I say, it can work for a while. But unless you're willing to really live on a mountaintop, you're going to encounter it. You're going to have to deal with it. And they, to me, are very exciting opportunities to do just what I explained, that process of going in to something that seems overwhelming and negative, and taking the energy out and recognizing it for what it is. I mean, that's an amazing process that you can use with anything in your life. But I find it particularly helpful to focus on media stories that seem to have gone rampant and out of control. So today on the show, we're talking about health and wellness in the transition era. And if you've listened to the show before, you know what I mean by the transition era. That's the era we're living in now, where we're seeing things rapidly transform. The seeds of amazing social change planted and beginning to sprout, although the process is slow. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Some of the seeds that get damaged because they don't have the proper caretaking to grow at best, but many are very resilient and will grow in some of the harshest conditions. So what I mean by that, we're seeing seeds of social progress in areas of, like with the Black Lives Matter movement, and with the ever-growing awareness of income inequality, by the continued and sometimes tragic struggles in the Middle East after the Arab Spring, and also in places like Greece and the EU, which are trying to find ways to transform our money agreements. So all of these things are happening in the transition era, and on this show, for I guess about a year now, I've been focusing on different aspects of the transition era and what's changing, and why, and what experts think, and others think as well. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to we're going to look at the work of a futurist by the name of David Howell, and he and his co-author Jonathan Fleece have written a book about the new age of healthcare. And we're going to look at how some of the old ways of healing and medicinal care are new again. And we're going to also pop over to Dr. Weil, that's Dr. Andrew Weil, and look at some of the breakthrough ideas and activities that you can incorporate into your own life that will help you to lead, you know, and eat and think and breathe more healthily. So, first I want to talk about how we view medicine and how we view wellness. Now, obviously, there are a lot of changes within the system, the United States system that we call healthcare. And that's to be expected, and that's not what I'm referring to here. What I'm referring to here is the way that we are changing the way that we look at health. What does health mean? And how do we go about protecting it, ensuring it, and so on? Well, I mean, the changes are kind of obvious in a lot of ways. For instance, the term wellness that I use on this show and many other people use, that was a meaningless term. I'd say 25 years ago, 25 to 30 years ago, that was a meaningless term. Nobody knew what wellness meant. And what does wellness mean? Well, wellness, I guess, can be defined as a sense of well-being. The idea of wellness goes beyond just, physical symptoms or being physically fit. It incorporates factors that are psychological, emotional, and yes, for those who believe, spiritual. So wellness is a term that is often used, well, it's not used so much interchangeably as it is more often used hand in hand, like I used for the title of this episode, Health and Wellness. And as I think about it, I should have just used the term wellness, because there really isn't, you don't separate health and wellness so much anymore. And that's probably the biggest transition that the idea of health is going through, is that there's an understanding, and this goes along with the growing awareness and understanding that moves us away from the approach of Newtonian physics, in which everything is seen as a separate part made up of atoms that are very solid and very real, and nothing is interconnected other than through variety of physical means, and nothing affects the other. In other words, if you have a headache, you take aspirin for it. It shouldn't be thought that if you do a yoga pose, or if you take a walk outside for 15 minutes, or you turn on the music and jump around for a few minutes, that would be a cure for a headache. Nobody would think that. Nobody would get that there would be a connection. But now we know through research a great deal of connection between things like yoga poses and how they affect your physical comfort. So that's where we're moving. We're moving from the idea that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I was talking about Newtonian physics and the change and move away from that to the quantum physics model, which shows us that there are energy levels at a smaller or underneath the atomic level, and that they respond to other energies, and that nothing in the physical world is quite as solid as we think it is. We, through our own thoughts about it and our own energy patterns, create it. And everything is interconnected. So if I send good energy to my ankle, if it's feeling a little bit swollen or having a little bit of pain, it affects my ankle. If I do a yoga pose when I'm feeling depressed, it releases energy and perhaps some endorphins that may help to balance that out. So in general, what we're moving towards is a what they call a holistic view, certainly of health, but I think we're moving toward a holistic view of everything. You know, when people talk about the butterfly effect, that is, if you kill a butterfly in Africa, that it has rippling effects here in the United States and in other places across the globe. Well, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that everything is interconnected, so everything affects everything else. We often just don't know how, and in many cases don't know why. And up until really the past decade or so, researchers, scientists, doctors were surprisingly uncurious about these sorts of things. Those were really sort of the realms of the philosopher and the mystic and the, even the religious. But more and more scientists have begun to think about, how and why these connections are, and why we have dark matter in the universe that is responsible for 90% of what we see and yet is invisible. Scientists are beginning to ask the kinds of questions that maybe philosophers and mystics used to ask and still do. And they're finding answers that match up with the answers that mystics have known. So it's fascinating, and I've talked before on, since that's not our topic today, I won't go further into it, but I have talked about how the merging of science and religion is happening, quite often kicking and screaming into the horror of both science and spirituality and religion, but it is happening. But again, that's off topic, so I want to stay with talking about health. Now, as I said, this transition era, things don't just emerge and happen. Sometimes they happen quickly and smoothly, but for the most part, it's a back and forth process with sometimes taking a dip in what is ultimately going to be progressive change. But first, I want to talk about, there's an article about a new divide in deaths in America. And I'm sorry to be a bummer on a Sunday morning, but what public health experts are saying is that there is a rising death rate that is reflected in, they're talking specifically for white women who have traditionally been a very privileged demographic in that they tended to live much longer than men of all races. And all of a sudden, this is changing. This is changing. And they're seeing these changes playing out. And this is true not just for white people, it's certainly true for African Americans and Hispanics as well. But the areas in which they live, whether it's urban or rural, seem to play a big part in where death rates are rising. And it has to do with sort of the decaying areas in this country that where healthcare isn't easily accessible, and there's a lot of poverty. The United States is now considered to be the least healthiest affluent nation in the world. And I was surprised to find that it has been that way over the past 20 years. And what they're seeing in the rising death rate of what were before very privileged demographics is being driven by a number of factors. And it does seem to be based on where people are living in the rural South and Midwest, where they've been hit sort of the hardest as far as loss of jobs. And I think what it is a loss of hope, or a sense of helplessness that happens in a lot of these areas, where they don't feel like there's anywhere left to go. So things happen. They begin to eat a lot, for instance. And so obesity becomes a major player in this. And for instance, in Texas, a place called Victoria County, deaths among the 45 to 54-year-old white woman demographic climbed by 169% over a period of 16 years, since 2000. And as I said, counties like this that are across the South and the Midwest are showing similar doubling effects of the death rate. And so apparently a third of the adults in this county, Victoria County, that I was just telling you about, are obese. And that actually is the national average. 1/3 of all people are obese. 1 in 5 are smoking. But there's also been an amazing, I don't want to say amazing, that sounds like something that's really fun, but there's been a rise in heroin and other opioid addictions. And whenever there's that kind of a rise, well, you can tell that it's an escape. It's a way to try to find an escape from a miserable state of mind. So there's that aspect to it. Then there's apparently, according to this article here, and this is the article in the Washington Post I'm talking about, in Victoria County, the medical director, her name is Lisa Campbell, says she's been struck by how many white women she knows who have some kind of cancer. She says she finds it weird, actually. So are people who are struggling people who are in these areas and feeling helpless and overwhelmed? Are they just killing themselves? That's my question. So, I mean, this is not to shout out alarms here. You know, white women are still living much longer than not only white men, but certainly much longer than African American and Hispanics. African American death rates are the highest, are still much higher than white people. So, but the fact is, the matter is that there. I think the more important thing is to see how death rates are rising in these certain areas, and it has to do, as I said, with these these symptoms, things like obesity and drug addiction, are happening because there's a need to escape. And as this researcher here from Princeton, I'm sorry, she's an economist from Princeton University, found that particularly among those with a high school education or less, there was a higher mortality rate among middle-aged whites, and that there are millions of people underneath these statistics who are in pain. Well, yeah, that's true, but there's more African Americans and other minorities that are in pain. So it's interesting, as Americans, we are at a health disadvantage compared to other affluent countries. And that's, across the board. But there's a growing divide between urban and rural health and access to health. These white folks that are dying are not the elite white people. They may have a advantage or a privilege because of the color of their skin, but it's not helping them much in the situations they are in now. And it's interesting to note that Southern black women in midlife are now having a lower mortality rate than middle-aged white women. That's interesting. And, the poverty rate, certainly poverty rate among blacks is much higher, but white people are moving up in that category. Let's see. So it looks like, I'm looking at these graphs in Alabama, the death rate for white women ages 35 to 54 has increased, and the death rate for black women has decreased. So much so that they seem to be meeting right at the same point. So it seems to be they have the same death rate. Maybe black women just slightly higher. So that's a concern, and that's something that will certainly be the focus of many initiatives, and certainly through our healthcare reforms as they continue. And that's certainly part of the transition era too. So let me talk to you about these authors here. David Hull, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, is a futurist, and the author of the new health age and how health care will be transformed and is being transformed um, through a series of dramatic changes and breakthroughs and technological, wonders. We have things like nanites and other uh, computer-based changes that will help us to, pinpoint health problems earlier. But the transformation truly, I believe, is in the spirit and in the mind. So, what Mr. Hole has to say has much to do with that change in spirit. Since running short on time, I think I'm going to have to come back and talk more about this next week. But part of what is changing is our view of and the studies that are being done where things like meditation are being taken more seriously. The American Heart Association did a study that showed that regular meditation twice a day correlated with a 48% reduced rate of heart attack and stroke immediately. Blood pressure was reduced and anger decreased significantly among the meditation group that they studied. And transcendental meditation. Now, there's a phrase you probably haven't heard for a while. This is the technique. It's a type of meditation, and it apparently can turn the body's own pharmacy on to repair and maintain itself. And this is coming from the director of the Institute for Natural Medicine and Prevention in Iowa. So, this is U.S.-funded research that showing you that 20 minutes a day of meditating can cut your chances of heart attacks, strokes, sudden death. That's pretty amazing. You'd think people would be cheering about that, and you'd be hearing about it all over the place. I bet you hadn't heard about it at all. I can remember hearing about it once in a short segment on the radio. After that, the story disappeared. All right, last thing to wrap this up here. And yes, I think we're going to talk more about health and wellness next week. But for now, I want to talk about Huang Qin. Huang Qin, called the Chinese skull cap. Now, this plant has been used in traditional Chinese medicine, which is all plant-based, as is every indigenous culture across the planet has used plants as medicine. And we're going back to that, particularly as people begin to understand the health benefits of marijuana. Now more interest is in finding out what other plants can do. And so this is one of them, the Chinese skullcap known as Huang Qin, and it's traditionally used for fever, liver, and lung problems. And scientists have done some research to see that it uses a special pathway to make chemicals with potential cancer-fighting properties. And so they want to be able to scale up the production of this plant and use it as a base for new drugs. The plant is produces these chemicals known as flavonoids, and they are found in the plant kingdom in certain types of plants. And lab research has shown that these have anti-cancer properties, and they're hoping that this will lead to some effective cancer treatments. And the question then seems to be whether to use the plants as they are meant to be used, or to chemicalize them and try to break apart their molecules and sort of, extract what they are wanting to have and put it into pills. And this means that they need to understand how compounds are made in nature. Whereas traditional Chinese, medicine women and men knew how to use the roots, knew how to use them in combinations with other plants, and use them, not extract the remedy from the plant, but use the plant as the remedy. So scientists are scratching their head about this now, and they're starting to think, well, maybe we ought to think about that approach too. It's fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. So, I gotta run. But next week we will talk, I think, more about this shift in healthcare and all of that. But till then, take that step back,